Hey, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal, and welcome to My Kind of Country, an integral stage series exploring the personal experience of politics, nationhood, and civic spirit through the lens of developmental, transformational, regenerative, and multidimensional thinkers. Today, we're very pleased to be joined by someone who's seen and felt deeply into the machinery of American politics, and who has also been a persistent advocate for systemic and spiritual approaches to restoring the soul of her nation. Hi, Marianne. Good to see you.
Oh, it's good to see you too. Thank you so much.
Well, to start off in a really personal way, what does it feel to be an American right now in this moment?
Very sad. Very sad. We could lose the whole thing. It could go either way. It could go either way.
Yeah.
And I think I have an image of an embryo. When you see the pictures and you see the organs growing, we need to grow a spine. And I think that it's happening. I do. I think that since election day, there's been a massive amount of waking up and growing up. But we have about 5 minutes
Mm.
to do it in
Yeah, because
because
that seems like the obvious question, which is spinal development takes as long as it takes. How long is it going to take for the emerging embryo of the American soul in this moment to get that spine?
the American spine, because the soul can't be uncreated. The soul has always been there, but eclipsed. Spine is what we've lost, and clarity, intellectual clarity. Um, we've been played, confused, distracted. I would think that you'd agree with me that it'll take an instant if we align ourselves, if a critical mass of us align ourselves with a combination of understanding, urgency, and courage, then we shift right into a realm where it takes no time at all. Whether or not that will happen, I think you have to go after something without thinking about whether or not it will pay off in terms you can quantify. You know, a line that I heard so many years ago, I think it's anonymous, I've never heard it, who it was referred to, who it was said by, to be fully invested in an effort and unattached to its results. There's an ideal here, so worth dying for. And so at a certain point, I would think you'd agree, you're serving the ages, whether or not it
Yeah,
pays off
I
in your
I
life.
I also think I would agree. Um, as an observer of American politics, I was excited to see you on debate stages over the years, right? I thought you had nuanced answers. I thought you sidestepped a lot of the verbal traps and limiting assumptions of normal political discourse. You were very candid. And I think importantly, very importantly to me, it seemed like you kept trying to remind the Democratic Party that the situation of the nation and the force of Donald Trump couldn't be dealt with just as a technocratic problem of policy and marketing, that it was also a spiritual, or there was some shamanic strategy that was needed to address this at the level of energy and collective spirit and consciousness. So, given that, it was hard for me to watch you being treated often as crazy or irrelevant, to see the Democrats refuse any real primary process, to see the mainstream media basically ignore you. What was it like for you as a human being to live through all of that? Because it was difficult just to watch it.
Traumatizing. Um, we talk about past traumatic stress. There's present traumatic stress. Traumatizing. But in the aftermath of that, and in a way, the continuation of that, because even now, when it's clear to the intelligent observer that everything I said was what we needed to say, and people will say, well, Bernie had it right. Well, Bernie wasn't running. I was saying those things. Even now, with the continued erasure and invisibilization, which is, it's like being killed by ice rather than fire. You're stuck in a block of ice. But I've also known, in terms of that intersection of that aspect versus this aspect, that my personal growth work, I stand at a fork in the road. How are you gonna do this? You're gonna get stuck in, poor me, they were mean to me, poor me, nobody loves me, and not forgive and not own your own part in it, because you can do that. And that road says angry, bitter old woman. You can do that, or you can see the incredible amount of treasure involved here. You talked a couple minutes ago about the machine. I've been there. I've been shredded by the machine. So what does that mean? That means, number one, I have a visceral knowledge of the machine. Number two, I'm still here, which also says something, right? So if I, in any situation, as you well know, you're not always in control of what happens, although you have to take responsibility for your own part in creating it. I get that. But you're always a choice and responsible for who you choose to be in the space of what happened. And so when I think, I want to be a version of myself that's so cool about this. It happened. I learned, I grew. I'm not right there yet, but so that's the paradox, isn't it? You asked me, how was it? Traumatizing. On a human level, brutal. The level of everything possible we could talk about. Yeah, it happened. It was there. And thank you for acknowledging it, because that right there makes me feel better, because part of the crazy is people not even seeing it, right? And I'm cool. Not my emotional body, not yet totally there, but closer than I would have imagined 3 months ago. And I also feel it's almost like I have secrets to share. And they're dark secrets, but it's not anything people don't either know or suspect. But I think it's things people, if we have any hope of dismantling, people need to understand. And I feel like I've traversed into some very dark corners. And then this goes back to what you were talking about before, is, do you need the majority or do you just need a critical mass? Because if you just need a critical mass, in order for the flip to occur, I think, going back to the idea that so much awakening has occurred in the last, I think there's a lot of possibility inherent in this moment. I think we're pregnant with something.
When you say something as juicy as I have dark secrets to share, what sort of things are you thinking? What's in that box of dark secrets?
The level of unbelievable institutional resistance, even in institutions that we had thought of as the ones that would save us, save us. It's resistance to what you and I would see as free thought. It's resistance to an actual agenda of working class repair. It's actual resistance to democracy itself, if that gets in the way of its corporate agenda. The level of, I would ask you this, we've got to come up with some word other than brainwashing. the stupor, the mesmerization, the complete nullification of critical thinking that people, and also I think the ways in which all of us, and I do mean all of us, are tempted to surrender our own free thought to forces which do not wish us well. Now, I think, there's that, I'm sure you've read that book, Letters to a Young Poet.
Mhm.
So there's a place there where he says, when you don't have the answer to something, live the question. That's particularly difficult for the American temperament. It is a national temperamental issue. Give me a to-do list. Just tell me what to do. And that's a high side of the American mind. Tell us what to do, we'll do it. This is not a moment when there are 5 easy steps. This is a moment when the best thinkers, and I mean the best thinkers, have no fucking clue what to do right now. But this then takes us back into the imaginal realms, the kinds of things that we're all into, which is you just have to be in the alchemy of this moment with its grief, with its sorrow, taking full responsibility for your part, forgiving other people for theirs. And out of that is going to emerge in ways that we can't possibly formulate because it's not coming from the rational mind. It's literally coming from right out of the blue, right? The quantum. And I see that happening. I used to say it's the 11th hour, but it's not midnight yet. Well, it's about 11:55 right now. On the other hand, read Euripides, read the ancient Greeks, because this is where that Deus ex machina happens. And when I was younger, I used to think, well, what kind of God waits till like the last second to appear? And as I got older, of course, I realized, no, it's you wait till the last second to get it. But bring on the gods.
I like that. Bring on the gods.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you mentioned the American temperament, and one of the things I'm really curious about in talking to people in different countries is when they first recognize themselves as being part of something like that. Like when you look back at your own life, when did you first notice that you were in a country? When did you first feel, oh, I'm an American? Like how did America come into your consciousness as a human being?
When I was a little girl, behind the couch in the den was a long table. And on the long table was a big atlas. And my father was an immigration lawyer. And my brother's an immigration lawyer. My cousin was an immigration lawyer. So immigration was an issue. It's dinner table talk. And my father used to go to the atlas and he would say, kids, God didn't draw a line between the United States and Canada. Because you know how you look at the atlas and you see it with the borders and then you see it like without them? God didn't draw a line between the United States and Canada. God didn't draw a line between France and Spain. God didn't draw a line between the United States and Mexico. So on one hand, I was raised with the sense of global identification. And my parents were world travelers. And so starting from when I was 10 years old, international travel was very much a part of my experience. But it's interesting because just like you don't really know yourself outside relationship with others, you don't see America until and unless you travel. And that's actually one of the worst things that's happened. Americans don't travel. Americans, not enough people travel and just are clueless and so easily led astray into delusions of superiority, separation, ignorance. But I feel very blessed that as a child I saw, oh no, there's a way bigger world there. But that didn't make me lose a sense of what it means to be a citizen of the United States. It made me more aware of my responsibility to help take responsibility for our mistakes, as well as wield the extraordinary power of our country well. The right, too many people on the right only want to talk about this whitewashed version of America and as though we've never done anything wrong. It's as though outrageous, or as though we're not doing anything wrong right now. But the left, I think, is equally unbalanced at times. Only want to identify where we've done wrong, what we've done wrong, with no larger context of the profoundly positive ideals on which this whole thing was founded, the unbelievable sacrifices that people have made throughout our history to expand the franchise of possibility, and to hold that juxtaposition within us. I don't think that it's any different than us as people. You know, you've done some things wrong, you've done some things right. And that's why a nation is that way. You know, it's human beings. And I think that this is a moment in history, not just in terms of nations, but in terms of all of us. Where have you gotten it wrong? Where have you gotten it right? Where you've gotten it wrong, you need to atone, you need to make amends, you need to get it together right now. Where have you gotten it right? You need to get it even better, because this is the moment. That's how it feels to me.
The people that appear to be most tuned into recalling the inspirational and heroic dimensions of their country very often prefer a kind of mythic simplification, and they get uncomfortable when the people who want to bring in these are the things we got wrong try to bring that argument up. It sounds like it's too complicated. It sounds to them, in my view, like something that would risk their ability to have faith in the inspirational aspects of their history,
That's
right?
so
Do you see
interesting.
that? Like, how do you hold that paradox?
You are describing something which I recognize, but I also see it as aberrational. Take the abolitionists, who was certainly a hero. There was both and. I recognize the evil of slavery. I recognize the vision of the founders. Look at Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is a perfect example. He is said to have said as a young man, he had an experience that a lot of people had who sort of flipped over into the abolitionist perspective. A lot of times it was based on one of two experiences. Either you happened to be traveling in the South and you actually saw something like a group of, enslaved people being led or something, and it just cracked you open and you could never unsee it. Or a lot of people had that sort of amazing grace moment when they saw a slave auction. And it's reported that as a young man, years before he was president, Abraham Lincoln saw a slave auction and said to a friend next to him, if I ever have a chance to hit it, I'm going to hit it hard. Okay. So if anyone came, not that he was an early provocateur, actually, but ultimately the leader of the movement of the ultimate movement of abolition, Civil War. So he certainly recognized the evils. And there were many people at the time who said, give it up, let them go, let them secede. If they want to secede, let them secede. Hey, listen, Layman, there are people even today who say, maybe it would have been better. They'd be this far right little country. We'd be more like Canada. People talk about that all the time. We could be right. Okay. But the reason he was not open to that argument was because the slave owning South had plans. They had plans to take slave owning into Cuba. They had plans to take slave owning into Latin America. Right? He said, this is not just a monster that would be contained. Okay, that's number one. So he saw the evil. But his entire philosophical, emotional, psychological, his spine came from his commitment to the Declaration of Independence. That's when the Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And then he goes on to say, we met on this battlefield to prove whether or not a nation so conceived can long endure. So he revered the founding principles. He revered the idea that a country had been founded on the nation that all men are created equal, and that government's responsibility was to secure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that and slavery could not coexist. So whether it was Abraham Lincoln with slavery, whether it was the women's suffragists, whose whole thing was, well, wait a minute, if we're supposed to be all men are created equal, that must include women. It's the basis of the early labor, which is it's not fair. We're a nation founded on the idea that everybody should have a shot. It's not fair that some people get to hoard all the money. And same with segregation. So we as a nation were far more mature before. This complete complete crossing of the wires, thinking that the people who are the dominators, the forces of injustice are your friends, and thinking that the people who are the most at the effect of and victimized by those forces are your enemy. This is new. This is new, and it's fortified by social media. We're in a pickle now.
How new is it? Where do you see that trajectory changing historically?
That's such an interesting question. Well, I think that two things happened. When I was growing up, and I'm sure this is as true in Canada or in any other country, because countries are made up of people. We always had our bigots, racists, homophobes, anti-Semites, of course. But even when I was growing up, there was this sense of guardrails made of social consensus. That there was a social consensus of when people were like, no, that's crazy. A man named David Duke is an example. No major political party is going to give those people a major megaphone. But two things happen simultaneously, somewhat simultaneously. Number one, social media, where anybody can have a platform. I mean, if Hitler were alive today, he'd be taking 30-second ads out on Facebook. And then a lot of people, free speech, free speech, free speech, but a free speech conversation without any larger, at least consideration of some of the fallout, is to me not a deep conversation. And at pretty much at the same time, there's one malignant narcissist who saw all that and went, oh, I can use that to build his own political power. A man without conscience. Not a stupid man. He's not. People really, in fact, part of the problem with the left is they underestimated him on some levels. And the combination of the two just dissolved the guardrails. Plus undereducation of the American people, and very perverse and malicious forces, not just from other countries, not just Iran or China or Russia. No, right here. I know. Who took all those dots and gleefully confused them. Using algorithms and so forth, it's not that hard to do. Character assassinate here, spread a few false narratives over there, they go viral.
So this last election, right? There's this malignant narcissist, as you call him, and then there's Kamala Harris, whose rise to candidacy must have been mixed or galling for you in various ways. but you also appreciate that she's not this malignant narcissist. Now, looking at her campaign, it's an interesting thing. Like, maybe she would have made an okay president. From my point of view, she didn't look like a very compelling candidate, and I think a lot of people shared that sensibility. It seemed to me like the event of her assuming the candidacy and all that talk about vibes had some energy to it, but then nothing followed that up. I'm curious what your impression of her campaign was. You know, what do you think she could have done that would have made the couple extra percentage point difference that might set the country in a different direction?
She was not democratically placed there. And therefore, what Martin Luther King would call the cosmic companionship of democracy did not surround her. She did not have the mantle on an energetic level of democratic legitimacy. It's not that she herself is bad, but the machine within which she was operating is sociopathic. And it is not dedicated to democracy. And if it had been dedicated to democracy, a primary would have been held. If it was dedicated to democracy, they would never have thought, they would never have had the audacity to think, oh, we're going to put up Kamala now. And the obvious level of puppetry did them in. On a human level, I feel compassion for her. But on the other hand, she was part of the whole thing from the beginning.
I think
What
one
she
of
could
the
have done, you
things,
said, what could she have done?
yeah,
She could have said, well, she herself could have stood for open primary. Under normal circumstances, in a situation like that, I don't want to go into any further forensic autopsy there. It doesn't help. I think that was so clearly repudiated by the American people. But unfortunately, what could be argued was a much worse alternative was embraced.
a different kind of question comes up for me, which is um, about the difficulty of getting better candidates in general. And I'm trying to think what I mean by a good candidate. And I guess I mean someone who's, both a futurist and a traditionalist, someone who has the goodwill to serve and the intelligence to know what might actually help, enough charisma to appeal to the public, some kind of emotional connection to both left and right, and the ability to somehow survive backrooms and backstabbings. Like, that's a difficult combination of qualities to get in a person. So it's rare enough that anybody would have even a few of those together. But then on top of that, it seems even rarer that such a person would decide to invest their time and energy and heart into the machinery and atmosphere of the American political process, even though we know it's crucial and urgent that there be better candidates and lots of them. Um, I know people who are on the fence about how involved they're willing to be in the process, and I'm curious, what did it take for you to actually make that decision to get directly involved in American politics?
First of all, I think, and I think you would probably agree with me, that there has been over the last 20 years a real quickening of exactly the kind of energies that you and I are both devoted to. I think there are so many people who are ripe, but it's like we're in a pot and the system keeps the lid on it. And so once their heads touch the lid, they go, well, it's just not even an option. So they don't take that next step. It's not that they're saying, I'm ambivalent about participating, or at least if they're still saying that after what's happened over the last 3 weeks, then they're not in that place actually. right? Because we're now at a point where you can know everything, you can have been through everything, you can have analyzed everything, you can get all this quantum shit. And at a certain point, do you have the courage to go in there? That's that I think we have enough people who would say, yes, I would actually. The problem is money. So when a political party in the United States says to somebody thinking of running for Congress, let's say, and they are looking to recruit candidates, their first question is, can you self-fund? Can you self-fund means, do you have $1 million lying around that you can risk at the card table? And anyone who doesn't is considered too often riffraff. They won't say it. But by definition, somebody who doesn't have that and knows how difficult it is to get in probably feels some anger about it. And that anger is seen as the narratives that they spin. So we need more people who to stop being so precious. Like, and I think people like yourself actually are a perfect example of what is needed in leadership. If you read Brothers Karamazov?
Mhm.
Okay. Remember at the beginning, he's in the monastery and he says, I just want to stay here with you. So the monks are, I just want to stay here with you. They go, gotta go out there. Because what happens with all of the things that we're into, it becomes so comfortable. It becomes so comfortable. Let me just be around people who see what I see. Let's just do this and play all these wonderful. And then at a certain point, it's like, if we're not willing to take it out of the sack, the baby has to burst into the sack. Birth is a process. I remember reading one of those books years ago, Bartholomew or someone, has said, tell them death is easy, birth is hard. Because we've been in the womb and it's so wonderful and warm. To actually go through a birth canal and actually have to face that light and be among those people who don't understand anything and who don't love us. That's how they get us, though. They provide enough space for us to be comfortable so that they don't have to worry about us coming after them. Am I wrong? Am I wrong about that?
I mean, I think there's a couple of different lenses that could be brought to bear on it, but I think that's roughly correct. I
I
think a lot
recognize.
of the people, yeah, I mean, people who are emotionally and cognitively and spiritually in a good enough place that they have enough inner riches to see a lot of the dynamics that are at work and to have mobilized a lot of compassion for diverse types of people, they're usually in a spot in their life where it feels really good. They want to devote themselves to continue doing inner work. They're very committed to their intimate partners. That's a tough thing to risk by pushing past the lid of the pot, especially if you don't have the cash on hand.
So absolutely, and I submit that collectively we do have the cash on hand if we were there for one another. I mean, uh, we might not have billionaires ready to, start a super PAC to make it happen. But if everybody who really saw what you and I see sent $5, we'd have the money. And I know that that's part of what I know from experience. We like to just kind of watch the dancing. It can become, ooh, it's so fascinating to observe.
Yeah, there's a kind of I mean, in both spiritual and developmental circles, there's a bias toward the optical metaphor, right? That I'm ultimately my nature is the witness. I'm going to be the watcher. I don't want to get dirty. I don't want to get too engaged. I don't want to risk slipping back into my lower self by really struggling for something.
Let's talk about that though, because what you just described is that birth canal. If the baby never gets born, then that's when you've got a problem where both mother and child could die. That's when sometimes they have to go take that baby, or the mom herself will die. I mean, for my first question to you about that, because I certainly agree with you, that's where we are. It's hard to know historically. If you look at the great movements in history, we can't really know if they were there because by definition, it's almost an underground. We wear a veil. But I suspect, I don't know, you can look at a lot of like I don't know if you've ever read that book. I forget what its name was, but it was a lot about how the Third Reich was a satanic cult. Have you read about all that with
I know some. I haven't read any specific books on it, but I'm aware in
magic?
general of
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So some of the darkest forces in history have recognized metaphysical powers. But then on the other hand, it's not like those who defeated them. If you look at someone like a Roosevelt or an Eisenhower, I don't think those guys were metaphysicians. Definitely not. But I think their sheer commitment and devotion to human goodness, not that they weren't human and didn't have their own stuff, but the basic, if you go, have you ever been to Normandy?
No.
I highly recommend that you do. Canada was very much a part of all that, obviously. The European nations, Canada, the United States. That the will, not just the machinery, not just the military power, the will that was harnessed. It's a very emotional experience to go to Normandy. Many of the barges are still in the water. And there's great museum exhibits that explain to you who was where, which beach, who was Canada, who was, I mean, it's incredible. My fear is that we don't have that now. Some of the people who in a previous age would have been the first on the beach today are talking about Viktor Orban like he's a good guy. Thinking some of these authoritarian figures, including one in our own midst, well, might not be so bad.
Some of that, I wonder that if there's an insufficient integration of aggression, of military sort of in the left and the center left, so that it leaves it to the right. Because, like, I mean, I grew up, I spent a lot of time in Victoria on the West Coast, right? And I was surprised to learn one day that the number one industry in Victoria is the Navy, because nobody who lives downtown ever even sees anyone in the Navy, right? There isn't this interpenetration of the military with the people. So they're sequestered with that spirit of intervention and courage, and we're sequestered with an analysis that doesn't touch that emotionally.
Well, it's interesting because when you said what you just said, I thought you were going to a different place, but it's related. Where I thought you were going was, Germaine Greer, very famous, I think she was an Australian or New Zealand, I'm not sure which, I think Australian feminist, said the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, but fraternity. The right in America is imbalanced in the direction of an overemphasis on the masculine, even at the expense and dominating the feminine. But on the left, I say to people all the time, everybody talks about the divine feminine. Well, there's a divine masculine too. And I think the left has exalted the feminine at the expense of an appreciation for the masculine. I think that's part of why
Yeah.
Donald Trump has been so attractive to certain male figures, particularly young men feeling disempowered,
That's
right?
definitely a lot of what I'm hearing and sensing from people, which is this
And
sense
if
that, like,
you,
yeah, go ahead.
well, if you don't have that, you don't have the necessary aggression.
Mhm.
Not all aggression is bad. If you take a microscope and you look at what happens when a little blade of grass is coming up through the ground, and you watch at what it does on a microscopic level to the pieces of dirt around it, or you look at the birth of a child, what it means to get through that, like, I'm coming,
Yeah.
watch out. That's that's the active. The active is as important as the passive. And what I saw in my campaign was this willingness of the left to just kind of observe the whole thing rather than have a strategic consciousness regarding electoral power. And that affected me and my campaign deeply. Like, it was heartbreaking.
So, I think there's ideally a widespread recognition that some elements of the feminine have been marginalized, suppressed, terrorized through various elements of our inherited culture, and that we have to continue improving that in a very dramatic way. But there is this problem of men, maybe particularly young men, feeling emotional pain, feeling isolation, feeling they're not welcome in the new values, feeling they're not welcome in the center left parties. And I'm curious, I guess kind of two questions come up for me. One is Marianne Williamson as president. How does she think about a better wars as
Better
opposed to
what?
just better wars? Because one way is to think like we just want no wars and like that would be ideal, but to get there
Oh,
we have to think better wars. I was thinking about that since you mentioned Normandy, because there was a time when American soldiers, people rejoiced to see the American military in their country. And it seems like that's a bit forgotten in the world. So, on the one hand, how do you, as a leader, mobilize aggression in a better way? But as a candidate as well, how do you excite reasonably healthy versions of masculine energy to get involved with a movement, a party, a political principle, something like that? Maybe
well,
two different, completely different answers. I don't know, but that's what's on my mind.
militarily, the United States has squandered our moral authority. During World War II, we have moral authority. But you have enough Vietnams and Iraqs and way too much time doing the wrong thing in Afghanistan. The rest of the world just doesn't buy it anymore. So you gain back trust, whether as a nation or an individual, by acting differently now. Your words are not enough, but you act differently and let people see that. That's number one. In terms of young men, we have we have to recognize the psychic annihilation and emasculation that has resulted from a devastating economic paradigm that puts short-term corporate profits before the dignity of human beings and the power, particularly of men, to produce. I told you before that I lived in Detroit, in the greater Detroit area. And I was a non-denominational minister at a spiritual center there. And most of the people, it was in a blue collar neighborhood, and most of the people that I counseled daily were in some way, at least indirectly, connected to the auto industry. And I was there when things began to implode. Now, this is a generalization, but I know you'll understand what I'm saying. For the most part, if a woman loses her job and the times are rough, it's tough and it's an economic crisis. And I got to feed the kids and I got to pay the rent, etc. What I saw among men was that it was much more than just a financial crisis. It was a psychological crisis. It was an emotional crisis. I saw men of power and dignity and strength sit in my office, tears running down their cheeks. My kids won't respect me. My wife is taking care of me. And that what the pain in their voices that when you sign trade deals, when you enable corporations to just take the factory elsewhere, rob these communities of their jobs, you rob people of more than money, more than jobs. You rob them of place. You rob them of pride. You rob them of dignity. You have to be a willing dolt to not recognize how dangerous this is, because that kind of thing forms a petri dish. It always has, out of which all manner of personal and societal dysfunction becomes inevitable. And that includes ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. If after World War I, the Allies, and this is one where I actually have to give it to Woodrow Wilson, which is not something I would normally do. He kept saying this is a bad idea. The punishing policies towards the Germans after World War I, basically reparations were Deutschmark till we tell you to stop. The crushing of the so-called enemy of the victim, the crushing of the losing side by victors who had no understanding of the psychological dangers there, just created this open field, this just fertile ground for Hitler. That's why after World War II, we did it so differently. The Marshall Plan, helping to rebuild helping to rebuild Japan. There's nothing more dangerous than kicking people when they're down. So as president, that level of psychological and emotional astuteness is absolutely necessary for leadership in the 21st century. And the traditional political class in the United States doesn't have a clue. They are technocrats, they are mechanics, they know how to treat symptoms. They don't even have a recognition that root cause is an issue. And that's why we're in trouble. And that goes back to what you and I were saying. People who do have got to get in there and support people when they do. Our crowd is too easy with the word support. Oh, I really support you. Am I wrong?
No, it's a very easy thing to say, and it's a very easy thing to superficially feel in the moment in a way that's disconnected from
Yeah, you
behavior.
support me because I haven't seen a check. Yeah.
When I'm thinking about the shared and sacred civic spirit of a nation, there's a huge range of ways to think about that. It could be just an abstraction. It could be something that exists in a metaphysical, imaginal terrain. But I'm curious when we look at the United States and we say, okay, how do we liberate and empower and cultivate more depth of shared sacred spirit among the citizens? And okay, this is a multiple choice question. Like, is it A, we mostly have to heal insufficiently acknowledged problems from our past, right? Whether it's slavery, whether it's the way people related to indigenous peoples when they came in, there are these traumas in the collective psyche. Is that the main mover, that those are unhealed? Is the main mover that multinational corporations and homegrown oligarchs actually benefit from there being a tattered social fabric? Or is it just that we don't have any real plan or infrastructure or institutions to cultivate an enriched shared spirit?
All three. But this is the heartbreak that I live with. I have seen, and I've run for president twice now, the American people are not the problem. We're as decent and intelligent as anyone else. We're not better than anybody, God knows, but we're no worse. What I have experienced over and over and over is if you sit down with a group of Americans, it could be farmers in Iowa who tend to be highly educated, anywhere in this country. and you talk to people about what you just said in a way that is humble and just like, we got to talk about this. It is absolutely my conviction, born of experience, that we have enough Americans who would say, yeah, we need to do that. This country elected Lincoln, and this country elected Obama thinking he was who he said he was, right? So the problem is not that we have to create that. The problem is how hard it is to harness it for political purposes because of the institutional resistance to it. And the problem we have here in the United States and what Americans are grappling with right now is if the Democratic Party won't do it, what do we do? Well, if we go third party, there's a lot of value there. There's certainly have voices in the past, but we got to handle this within 4 years. So it's a terrible conundrum. But the American people are ready. And I give credit to people such as yourself and so much of the work that's gone on in the last 20 years. A lot of it has just kind of made its way into the ethers, whether people intellectually know it or not. I'll tell you something, Layman. In talking to you, I'm not surprised at any of the perspicacity or anything because you're known for it and you're already in that field as someone known. I am now, because I have a new book that came out and I'm doing interviews and I'm so impressed. I'm just so impressed by a younger generation and the questions they're asking, the conversations they're ready for. The people are not the problem. The problem we have is this lid. Put a lid on it, and they do put a lid on it. And so then anyone such as myself who might be putting out a message that would vibrate at a level of higher listening, oh, shut her down. And I think the fact that there was such a de-amplification of my campaign, extraordinarily so, and false narratives, smears, infiltration, the fact that we still got almost 500,000 votes says to me that of those who heard me, there was absolutely an affirmation that, yeah, we got to do some of this internal as well as external analysis and action. And I think about what, might have happened if there had been greater amplification, which is not to say I don't take responsibility for my part, because I do. I mean, it's both and in life. We need a miracle now. But I think within the worldview that we discuss, embracing, accepting, and recognizing that miracles happen in the presence of love is our ticket.
So if we have to attune to and be ready for the miraculous to intervene at various points in this process, I mean, do you feel like it's more possible for the miraculous to intervene in the creation of some kind of viable third-party movement in the next few years, or more possible the miraculous can intervene in some kind of reorganization or revolution within the Democratic Party itself?
Well, as you well know, the consciousness doesn't care about form. So that miracle will be wherever the people are who work the miracle. I see it because the bottom line is I don't know the answer, and I'm dealing with that question just like I think millions of people are, and I don't know the answer because I get, oh, this is a conundrum. So on a certain level, I don't know, but I do know this. Take something like the spiritual rethink, the great spiritual and religious rethink. Some people's hearts have moved them to be part of that revolution of thought within traditional religious institutions. Other people's hearts have led them to do this outside. I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think, the traditionalists would say God is preparing his people, and some people's dharma is to revolutionize an old tradition. Other people's dharma is to take a hammer to it. So I don't, and what is the most effective way forward for us as Americans? I don't know the answer. I know that I'm not the only one living with the question, but that goes back to Rilke and what I was saying about Americans with a to-do list. We like a to-do list. It's like people want to know in response to what you were saying, okay, tell me what we need to do. There is no, this is a cancer that is already metastasized. This is not like, okay, we just go in and remove the tumor. It's too late for that. It's a cancer that is metastasized. We need an integrative approach to healing it. And that means, I'm reminded of the line from Martin Luther King, in order to create the beloved community, we need external changes in our circumstances and internal qualitative shifts in our souls. The question now is not just what do we do? The overriding question for the moment is, who do we need to be? How do we build a nervous system, not just the intellectual understanding, but the nervous system, the connection, like you and I were talking about, my brain gets it, my heart is prepared for it, and I have the spine to hold it all together. When we are there, the forms will emerge because form follows consciousness. Consciousness doesn't follow form. So we're not yet at a place of that consciousness to know the answer. But when am I right? You very rarely do
Yeah,
I.
no, I mean, it's interesting because like one of the things that we do in the sort of integral type communities a lot is like run things from this side or run things from this side. So it's like, well, what do we change? The inside or the outside? Yes, like
It's both
there's a version of starting it from both sides. But I think when I look at something
integrated.
like Andrew Yang's Forward Party, right? It doesn't have a lot of traction, but the interesting thing is they're trying to foreground protocol changes, right? I've been a part of a lot of electoral reform movements who are like, doesn't matter. They think it doesn't matter where the people are. You fundamentally have to change the way we make the group decision. But the alternative explanation is just as relevant or often more relevant, which is none of that's going to matter unless we're the right people, right? Unless we are fully open, full spectrum human beings who are capable of invoking the energy and making the evaluations necessary as a group to figure out what would be the best change to a system in a moment.
Right. As Gandhi said, the end is inherent in the means. The old paradigm is the end justifies the means. Gandhi says, no, the end is inherent in the means. Angry people will not create peace in the world. People who are willing to compromise their ethics and their principles in order to get there will never get there. And I think that it's not just making the evaluation. It's having, as I said, the nervous system that will make us people who can endure this moment, because Americans have no idea what lies ahead. If you start bringing in the U.S. military for mass deportations, there's going to be hysteria in this country. And it's going to be, okay, are you going to just start drinking or using drugs or nullifying or looking away? Or are you going to be someone who can stand this and stand within it? Because only when we prepare our nervous systems to be able to endure this, will we also become the people necessary to transform this. This is going to be a whole lot more than intellectual analysis or evaluation is going to be demanded of us. That we are going to be shocked to our core if it goes that way.
Well, there's also the circles I travel in talk a lot about the meta crisis, which is like the multiple simultaneous crises, but they have something in common and they all require a transformation of our psychology and our society. But it seems like there are all these factors in the American system that are moving into a radical position that the people might not be prepared to handle. But there's general problem, right? Like the AI problem is global. When I listen to people talk about transgender, even though I'm very engaged in a lot of those things, I think this is already outdated. Trans species is already on the table, right? The complete undermining of so many things that we've accepted as the norms for human beings on this planet are up for grabs in the next generation, even in the next few years. So I feel like I run into hardly anybody who seems to be emotionally and energetically prepared for how strange it might be about to get.
I think that, well, first of all, I agree with you. Second of all, I think it's interesting speaking to you as a Canadian, and I'm sure that there are Canadians, Europeans, and Australians who are thinking about this. While we go through our nervous breakdown, you're going to have to hold it. You're going to have to hold the energy of Western ideals, Western liberalism, which in a way, I think there's been a little bit of a big tree syndrome, that the United States has been such a big tree that maybe to some extent Europeans, Australians, Canadians didn't have to. And even, well, so it's going to be interesting because you're going to have to now, because we might be absent from the field in ways. And I say this whenever I'm in countries such as yours, pray for us as we go through this, because I think there's so much disgust, so much of which I understand, but we don't need that now. Especially since so many of us do understand. We get it, we fucked up, we get it, we fucked up, we get it, we fucked up.
One of my curiosities in thinking about this discussion was around secrecy and transparency. It came up for me when you were in making your last remark, because I feel like um, my nervous system, maybe all nervous systems, has to have to make an effort to take on the burden of more exposure, of more transparency. But also, there's another burden of like taking on the idea of secrecy, or maybe there may be times to not reveal information, or even in leadership position, creatively deceive or massage the people, right? We have military secrets and secret ballots for a reason, because some things work better when information is constrained. But I'm curious how you hold that kind of paradoxical tension between the obvious need for more transparency in a lot of areas, but the practical need for secrecy and sometimes deception in other areas.
I think it's much like one's individual life. There is a role for discretion. Not everything has to be spewed. Not everything has to be said. But all of that is predicated on ethical people.
Mm.
So if you take, for instance, you could take something like classified documents in the United States, okay? The classified document system was never meant to be something that enabled the government to say, oh, that's inconvenient, so we're gonna call that classified so nobody can see it. That has happened so much. You look at the Wikipedia, not the Wikipedia, the Julian Assange and that collateral damage video, right? Too much was classified. And then journalists would say, well, what's in that document? I can't tell you, it's classified. Yeah, but nobody knows why it's classified. You do that so much that people don't trust the government anymore. I mean, during World War II, not World War II, during the Vietnam War, there was something called the My Lai massacre, where Americans went in and just massacred this village of Vietnamese. And America was collectively filled with shame. And it was healthy shame. So what the system has done is to make sure if there are any My Lai massacres, that people won't know about it, because that's inconvenient to the system. So they just started classifying everything that they didn't want people to know. So of course people are like, oh, this won't work. And now act like we want to know everything, we want to know everything, we want to know everything, when in fact what you were saying is also true. Some things we wouldn't have won World War II. And I say that we, you, us, all the allies, we wouldn't have won World War II if Hitler saw everything on the internet. I mean, that's what all that encoding machines, I mean, it's fascinating, but hello. So once again, there's no intellectual, rational formulation. It's called ethical decision making. Mm. But when government is not making ethical decisions, there's no trust, to the point where anything they say, and that's what's happened with our health institutions. That's this whole thing with, all the health stuff and the Bobby Kennedy. People don't trust anything. That's what's so dangerous now. And in a lot of cases with those agencies and so forth, They're responsible for the fact that the people don't trust them because they've been so captured by corporate power that now when they even have something meaningful to say, people are like, yeah, well, we don't believe you. Well, I understand.
Yeah, I mean, you hear this discourse around the people lack trust in their institutions, but you don't hear enough discourse around why don't institutions seem trustworthy?
Because they haven't been trusted, because they haven't been. Because
Yeah.
they've been, doing the bidding of big ag or big food or big pharma or military industrial, complex or big oil or whatever. And that's what's so dangerous. And that's what happens when the American government is based more on a governing principle of neoliberalism and corporate profits, as opposed to genuine democratic and humanitarian and ethical principles.
Well, I'm curious if you have hunches or imaginings about where you go next, because so much of what you're saying here, on the one hand, strikes me as like an essential eldership message to younger people who have the capacity and should be getting involved civically in American life. But on the other hand, in a complementary way, you're talking so much about having the right people, right? That it's predicated upon people with integrity. It's predicated upon people who are inhabiting their nervous systems more correctly and more openly and more robustly. So this is a kind of educational problem, right? It seems like what I'm hearing from you right now is we need to produce a lot more of the right people. How do you think about your role in doing something like that going forward?
Well, in some organized institutional way, like starting a 501(c)(4, I've thought about it, but the truth of the matter is the best platform for putting out such ideas is running. I ran.
Hmm.
I ran. So, and I like to think I planted some seeds. I do think some people are going, oops, we could have helped more. Going forward, I think that nature organizes itself. That's the beauty of even like you and me talking right now. You and I don't know who's going to be listening. Who are we to say? Nature organizes. So right now, it goes back to what I said before. Form, it's not a moment to know. It's not to me, it's not a moment where I go there, what form, but then I go, you're still in the process of the embryo, you're in an embryonic, the next phase of you is still in an embryonic stage. And when she is totally there, she'll know. Right. And in the meantime, who's to say that this isn't enough? If where we are is the phase of inquiry, we're doing it right this second. Only the mind would go, oh, but what should it be in the future? Well, I think what it should be is what it is. And, when the baby is forming in the womb, the mother's best aid to the process is sitting down in a very comfortable chair with her feet up, drinking a cup of chamomile tea, listening to music, perhaps finding peace. We're in that stage of pregnancy. And it takes how long it takes. We'll know when labor starts. And we'll all know, okay, positions. Right now, we're still learning our lines.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because that's so often how I feel, both in terms of being an engaged social agent and also in terms of just relating to my own psyche as it arises, that being the question is very often, first of all I can do. But second of all, it does something catalytic that trying to find the answer too
Absolutely.
soon doesn't do.
Absolutely. The problem is not that just that we didn't do the right things, is that we weren't the right people. We were confused, we were off. We weren't free thinking. I mean, when I think of my campaign and I think of all the people who just follow these dictates, the DNC says it has to be Joe. The DNC says we don't primary incumbent presidents. Well, I remember when Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy Sr. primaried Lyndon Johnson. They just made that up. No, you're a spoiler. Excuse me, can't be a spoiler in a primary. No, you're not credible to them. You haven't served in office. You think Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy have, or Donald Trump? The American people don't care. It's just this political class of elite in the Democratic Party. I mean, the lack of free thinking and spine. And then the way the system works is if you make a person radioactive, enough false narratives, she's a joke, blah, 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 then people are afraid to be public with their support because then people will think you're a joke. No, it was all on the level of our being. Now that's just in the case of my campaign, but my campaign is just one little piece. It's like a hologram. It's just one, it's a little hologram of the massive meta issue. Like, where were you? Where were we during all this? So we gotta clear all that up. We've got to atone. We've got to realize this amazingly precious thing. And by the way, Canada and Europe and Australia, I have great confidence. America is not, listen, it's sad, but it's not like, I get that you'll do fine, you know what I mean? Until we meet again at that higher level, because I do think America will get over this. But we have to spend this time atoning for how we let this happen, how we let something as important to the ages just fall through our fingers because we were distracted, because we were shopping, because we were shallow thinkers, because we were so into popular culture, because we were just thinking about so we have to go through the horror of this. We can displace it all onto Donald Trump, but we all contributed to the creation of the void that he filled, even if it was through non-participation. So we're dealing, the pregnancy is within, and there will be a time when it'll be out there, but it's like the mother, doesn't know, until technology, she didn't know the sex of the baby, didn't know what that baby looked like or what that baby was going to do. Just pregnant right now. See, that integral space needs more women, Layman.
It absolutely does. Although that's a question that has a lot of dimensions to it.
Yeah, well, that's so much of what's going on now. It's all men. It's like, excuse me? Yeah. Mm-hmm. We think too.
Yes, and there's getting more women involved and foregrounding them, but not foregrounding them at the expense of how they want to participate. Because sometimes people say, Layman, where are all the women? And sometimes I want to say, she's upstairs feeding the kids right now, right? Like, she doesn't necessarily want to be on the camera all the time the way I do. But that doesn't mean she's not in the discussion, right? So there are elements of like folding more of the feminine in, foregrounding the feminine more, but also I think not trying to make the feminine show up always the same way the masculine does, and like holding all three of those and maybe a few other things together.
Well, we are more than capable of holding the baby while we speak into the microphone.
Okay.
And we use it's not just that we're part of the discussion, it's that we have some things that are uniquely different, that are filters, somewhat different, not better,
Yeah.
but different, and that I feel form a complete whole.
Well, I appreciate the degree to which you're, bringing in pregnancy and gestational metaphors to thinking
Thank
about this,
you.
right? That's something that's not just going to come up when a bunch of men talk to each other.
That's right. That's exactly right. I've known Kim for years. Yeah, been around a long time.
I had a curiosity about what you think it takes to communicate effectively to the collective psyche, because you've been in a unique position to try to do that, right? And because one theory is constant repetition of simplified talking points is what it takes to get a message through to a mass rather than an individual. But on the other hand, we could say, well, that mass is attentive to constant novelty and surprise and entertainment and engagement. It can be too much the same or it can be too different or a sweet spot between those. How do you approach like the creative challenge of communicating to the mass mind?
There's a man named Arnold Patent, and he wrote a book with a line that has meant so much to me in my life. If you genuinely have something you need to say, there's someone out there who genuinely needs to hear it. I think the way you express yourself is perfect, Layman. I think the way I express myself is perfect. The problem is not how we express ourselves. The problem in a case like mine is that lid. So what happened in 1996 when Bill Clinton was president at the time in the United States, and I don't know how this works in Canada, but in the United States, like when I was growing up, it was codified into law that there would be diversification of opinion because the same company that owned the radio station was not allowed to own the TV station, was not allowed to own the newspaper. With the conglomeratization, it's all about monopolies. That's how corporate power is consolidated. In 1996, now there are only a few media companies who really control the flow of information. That's why independent media is such a big deal. So when you say, how do you talk? If I just been allowed to be on the Sunday news programs, if I've been allowed to be on CNN this time, if I've been allowed to be on MSNBC, which I was to some extent in 2020, but this time there was a decision made to invisibilize me, to erase me, to pretend that I wasn't there. In 2020, I had a CNN town hall. The problem is not, I know I've been at this a long time. I assume you've been at this a long time. I know how to talk to grownups. And I know that when I talk to you about certain things, there are some concepts, there's some languaging that I might not go into with a group, or for instance, I might talk in terms of more overtly religious or spiritual terms in one group that I wouldn't as a candidate. The problem is not that we don't know how to talk. The problem is not that we don't know how to express ourselves. We don't want to express like these message machine automatons. And it says in the Course in Miracles, people hear you on the level that you speak to them from. If you're really speaking from your heart, people will hear you from their heart. And I've talked to enough audiences. I have a 40-year career, longer. And there's a weird way, whole groups of people, you can fool an individual better than you can fool a room full of people. There's some group conscience. They register when you, that wasn't quite, fix that. Say, oh, well, I miscommunicated just now. Let me begin again. They're open to that. So that's why such voices are suppressed. Not because they don't know how to communicate, but because they do know how to communicate. So, for instance, in my case, and once again, I'm not using myself as an example because it's any more important than any other, but because it's the one I know. They'll say, oh, she's a joke. Why? Because they know I'm not. Oh, you wouldn't want to go hear her. No, or characters, whatever it is to make people go, oh, you wouldn't go hear her. Why? Because they know that actually, a lot of people say, actually, this makes sense. So I don't think you find, Walt Whitman had the voice of Walt Whitman. Emerson had the voice of Emerson. Wallace Stevens had the voice of Wallace Stevens. The creative person, and I think politics should be seen as a creative endeavor. You're not trying to get somebody else's voice or figuring out what your voice should be. Find your voice. And don't let anybody tell you, oh, no, you need to message it differently. Sometimes people say, well, Marianne, you use too big words. It delights me if something I say makes someone have to rush to the dictionary. And then people who say, oh, the average person wouldn't understand that. Well, that's not my experience of the quote unquote average person. My experience out there in the world is that people are smart. People are not stupid. And I think a lot of people have felt about the Democratic Party, even when they would agree more with the policies, did not like being patronized. did not like being condescended to by people who, number one, don't know as much as they think they know, and number two, are really blind to think that that person doesn't.
Yeah, it's a weird position for the Democratic Party to be in, where they simultaneously want to be the representative of the smarter people, and yet also give themselves the right to talk down to people and treat everyone as stupid. Right?
If
That
you
something's got to give.
if you have never had to make a decision between your insulin or your rent, wipe that smile off your face, because that smirk of yours, you don't know shit. I mean, in the United States, some graduates of Yale and Harvard have created a lot of this mess.
That reminds me of, I don't know if you've read any Nassim Taleb, the notion of skin in the game. He was a Wall Street trader who predicted the crash and went on to develop a theory of anti-fragility that has a lot of mathematics behind it.
Oh, I would love
Um,
to know more.
but Anti-Fragile is a really interesting book. And then the follow-up book was kind of ethics of anti-fragility that he called Skin in the Game, which is that there's an intelligence in us that's only activated when we have something at stake.
Oh my
And our
God, this is
system is,
so,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, please tell me, what is the name of the person?
Nassim Taleb.
I'd love to have information because that's right up my alley, what you just said. I
Yeah,
love.
sure. Well, I'll send you some links when we're done.
Great, thank you. Thank you. That's really cool because I agree. And I also agree with what you just said. You don't know till you have skin in the game. And that's what I meant before when you have these visceral, oh, my cells know. I don't just know. I have a visceral knowledge. And that's what I mean by smart. People who haven't wandered outside their gated communities to see what's going on out there, they don't know.
Well, I feel like this has been delightful and engaging and interesting and potentially relevant, and we're probably near the end of it. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have?
No, it was wonderful dancing with you, and I appreciate the opportunity. And uh, no, it's great. Thank you for
Okay, yeah.
thank
Well,
you.
maybe we can check in again sometime and
Yes,
see how it's unfolding to be the
yes.
question. And in the meantime, I mean, God bless America. I pray for the soul of the nation that you're embedded
Thank
in,
you,
and
and
for the
God
rest of
bless
us as well.
Canada too. God
I
bless
will,
Canada. You and I didn't go there, but and I don't think it's needed. But the fact that your prime minister had to feel that before he's even inaugurated, he needed to go down to Mar-a-Lago to. So God bless all of us. God bless the world right now.
God bless the world right now. All
Thank
right,
you so
lovely to
much.
see you, Marianne.
You too. Thank you.